Thank you. So as Chris said, my name's Tim. I work for SUSE, and I'm here to talk about Ruby and Ruby on Rails, which I've been using for about 4 years or so. And Ruby is a delightful language, and Rails is a very powerful framework. It does lots of things for you. But if you need to do something that's a little bit different than a standard web app deployment, if you're, say, packaging a Rails application as a native distro package, you can get into trouble and tend to feel kind of trapped or bound to specific version dependencies. You can have annoying build and deployment problems. So I've often found myself feeling like this poor sod, literally tied to the rails, hence the title of my talk. So a little bit of background. Who here is a Ruby developer? 1.5. Rails? None. Wow, cool. Okay, so these next slides are kind of worthwhile. Ruby, language created in the mid-90s by a Japanese fellow named Matz, who at the time said that he wanted a scripting language that was more powerful than Perl and more object-oriented than Python. Now, to me, that sounds like a really good way to start a fight, but this is his stated reason for creating the Ruby language. Then we've got Ruby Gems, which is a packaging system for Ruby bits and pieces. You might think of it as being like CPAN for Perl, or easy install for the Python package index, or node.js's npm thing. And there's rubygems.org, where all the gems are hosted, and there's a command line tool that you run gem install something or other to install that gem on your system, or uninstall or list whatever's there. And there's a bunch of other commands for creating your own gems and things. And then we've got Rails, which is a model view controller style web application framework. It's been around since 2004. It does a whole lot of stuff for you. It knows how to talk to SQL databases, does form field validation. It will help try to protect you from cross-site request forgery and scripting attacks and that sort of thing. And unsurprisingly, it's available as a gem. So you can go gem install Rails and have it. But on Linux at least, it's also, because it's a popular thing, it's also available as a native distro package, as an RPM or a DEB, which you can go and install using your native distro package management tools. So to create a Rails application, again from your terminal, you go Rails new my app, and that creates a skeleton of a application there. You can start it up, point your web browser at localhost, it goes, hey, Rails, yay. And the interesting thing here is when you run that first command, Rails new my app, it invokes this other thing called bundler to go and download all of the dependencies of your application and install them globally on your system. Possibly you don't want to do that. You may not want to clobber whatever's already on your system. And so instead you can run Rails new my app skip bundle, and it won't do that. And then later you can go bundle install standalone, and all of your dependencies will be pulled into a subdirectory of your application. They won't be clobbering whatever's on your system globally. And actually balling up all your dependencies like that in a usual deployment scenario where you're developing the web application yourself on your laptop or your desktop or whatever, and then you deploy it hopefully to a dev or test server and not straight into production. And you test it there for a while, and when it all works, you push it onto the production system. In that scenario, you're the one managing the deployment, and maybe you're not the one managing the system you're deploying to. Maybe it's hosted with Engine Yard or something, and you actually can't install your dependencies globally on the system you're deploying to. So packaging them all up with your application actually kind of makes sense in that scenario. This is all done for you by bundler. You've either written this thing called a gem file, or it's been created automatically when you created your Rails app. And it's actually just Ruby source. And this one here says that we're going to go and get all of our dependencies from rubygems.org. We're using Rails 3.2.12, some version of SQLite 3. We're using Sass, Coffee, and Uglifier because we're being fancy, and we're using jQuery because jQuery. Now, when you invoke bundler, or when your application starts up for that matter, because it invokes bundler then to verify that all your dependencies are there, It looks through your gem file, through the dependencies that you know about, and then it looks through all of them and their dependencies, and it generates this big dependency tree. And you'll notice some of these things have very specific versions in there, and some of them are a little bit fuzzy. These are the versions of all of the dependencies that were available on the system that you were doing your development on. Your application will only run if these dependencies are present. If those versions don't match on your deployment system, your application will go clunk. It just won't start. But again, in that traditional deployment scenario I mentioned, where you might not be controlling the server that you're deploying on, the base operating system can change and your application keeps running because you've balled all that stuff up inside. So if you're running the deployment, if you're keeping an eye on security updates for all your dependencies, if you're continually redeploying your application, that's actually okay. But if you're trying to do something a little bit different, like take a Rails app and then package it up as an RPM or a DEB so that somebody else can go and install that themselves on their own Linux system, it's a bit annoying. In my case, I'm doing exactly that. I have an application called Hawk, which stands for High Availability Web Console. We ship this on SUSE Linux, and I've got builds for Fedora, and somebody made an Ubuntu one a while ago. This is a management and monitoring tool for pacemaker high availability clusters, which just happens to be implemented as a Rails app. My users shouldn't care that it happens to be a Rails app. They shouldn't have to go and clone my source tree and run bundler and install things. They should be able to take my RPM, which is the Rails app and a few C binaries and a lighty config file and an init script, and just install that themselves on all of the nodes in their cluster and then just use it to monitor their cluster. It's not that people who run HA clusters aren't smart and couldn't go and do all that stuff, but they shouldn't have to, and they probably don't want to. So the question is, if I've used bundler to pack all the dependencies up into my application and then I've turned that into an RPM, what do I do about security updates? If there's a security update to Rails, I have to ship a new Hawk RPM, even if I haven't added any new functionality. And we have the same problem with a few other applications that we ship on SUSE Linux as RPMs. We've already got Rails as an RPM itself separately. We should just be able to ship new Rails RPMs and have our applications use it. It's packaging everything up into individual apps like that. It's crazy. We don't statically link all of our C applications. We have shared libraries for that. We should just be able to ship an updated Rails package and have it all just work. So, I know I'm not a stereotypical web developer responsible for doing the deployment myself, but how did we end up thinking that going back to the bad old days before dynamic libraries was a good idea as applied to Rails and bundler? I do get binding to a major version, but binding hard to a minor version or a point release is like, why does bundler think this is a good idea? And I was thinking about this late one night, and I thought maybe it's because we've forgotten, or worse yet, possibly never learned an important lesson. This is John Postel, without whom the internet wouldn't be what it is today. He was the editor of the RFC document series from 1969 until his death in 1998. He administered IANA until his death. He wrote and co-authored more than 200 RFCs, including the ones that define the internet protocol, so he's sort of important. And there's a quote that he's particularly famous for, which is, be liberal in what you accept and conservative in what you send. And this was written in the context of network protocols, but I think that this can be broadly applied to many fields of endeavor. But I'm not here for social commentary, so I'll stick to the Ruby and Rails thing. If bundler was adhering to this philosophy, it would make gemfile.log kind of fuzzy by default, or maybe it wouldn't include versions at all. It'd just be a dependency tree. If people developing gems themselves were adhering to this philosophy, they'd be taking great care to ensure API stability so that bundler wouldn't need to be so paranoid. And some of them are. Some people are doing a great job, but some of them aren't. They're just going, I really want version 3.5 of this thing. And, you know, I know that it's possible to deliberately specify fuzzy versions in your gem spec file. So if more people were doing that, it would make things a bit easier. Now I have to digress slightly into how software is installed, which will hopefully explain why I like distro packages as opposed to any other means of installing software. Who here has seen this or something like it recommended as a way of installing software? Okay. Every time you do this, someone on a security team somewhere, someone whose job it is to ensure that the software that we use is free from exploits, one of those people throws up their hands in despair, they throw all of their computer equipment out the window, it smashes into a pile of rubble on their driveway, and they give up and they go and live in the hills. Yes?
Who's doing it right now? Who just wrote that down?
What?
Who just wrote that down?
Tim already lives on a hill.
Yeah. I'm actually not a security professional. This actually isn't me, but I didn't want tattoos and a gun, a logic. Anyway, the problem with that command is that you're downloading something and just running it straight into a root shell. There could be DNS cache poisoning going on, a hacked router, a transparent proxy, something that gives a man-in-the-middle attack, so you're not downloading what you think you were meant to be getting. The server could have been compromised, so even if you are pulling something from where you think you're meant to be getting it from, you're not getting what you want. It's not an uncommonly suggested technique. This appeared on the Rackspace blog. I don't want to pick on Rackspace because they're a really great company and I know lots of people who work for them, but there was a blog post where they suggested that to install Rails on macOS, you should run Ruby and have it evaluate this thing that curl has just pulled straight out of GitHub. And just no. So getting away from that holy terror, is Ruby gems any better? Kinda, because you're getting things from one place, but not really. Because at the Ruby Nation conference a while ago, a guy called Ben Smith gave a talk called Hacking with Gems. Not hacking gems, but hacking with gems and using gems as an attack vector. He handed out these cards, and 10% of the attendees went home and ran this command. And the important thing to note is what this gem didn't do. It didn't steal anybody's passwords or add secret SSH keys to anybody's systems, but it could have. Tom, I think, mentioned to me at one point that it's not just Ruby. Jacob Kaplan-Moss at PyCon AU did the same thing, called it Python Nation, effectively. So these language-specific packaging things might be okay for developers, kind of, but I don't really want to foist this on my end users. And also, the RubyGem server suffered from that YAML exploit that Tom was just talking about earlier last year, and there was malicious code put up there. So if you're using distro packages, an RPM or a DEB or whatever, they're signed by your distro maintainers. It's been through one extra level of packaging, another level of QA. Depending on your distro, it might be well supported. The people doing the maintenance of it are probably working closely with upstream. And so distro packages give you one more level of testing and validation and trust, and this is why I would far rather install them than anything else. Back to Rails apps. Your distro, your Linux distro, will have packaged some gems as RPMs or DEBs. But we can still be screwed by bundler and gemfile.lock. One of my colleagues, Adam, put together this wiki page discussing strategies for packaging gems as RPMs and for packaging applications, packaging Rails applications as RPMs as well. And there's a whole lot of stuff in there, so you should look at that if you're interested in the big story. But the thing that I wanted to focus on was strategies for dealing with gemfile.lock, which ties your application to particular versions of its dependencies. The first two I'm going to kind of skim over because they're fine for developers, but they don't help end users. And that is to keep your gemfile.lock checked into your source repo. This can actually be good for developers because you know that you're testing against a particular set of dependencies that you're happy with right now. but you're bound to the dependencies on the development system, so your end users are still screwed. Multiple copies checked into a source repo with different sets of versions is interesting if you're having multiple teams working on the same project on possibly different target distributions, but again, is completely useless at the end user point. Slightly more interesting is if you generate the gemfile.lock when you're building your RPM or your DEB package, because that usually happens in a clean chroot environment which matches exactly what your target operating system will be, at least when the target operating system is released for the first time. But if somebody goes and updates, say, Rails on the target operating system and your application has a hard dependency on Rails 3.2.12, and a security update comes out for Rails and it's updated to 3.2.13, your application suddenly stops working because 3.2.12 isn't there anymore. So that doesn't quite get us there. Another strategy was to automatically generate gemfile.lock when the application runs. And this means that your application binds to whatever dependencies are present on the target system at runtime, but it also means that your init script or whatever it is that starts your application up has to delete the gemfile.lock every time it runs before it runs the application, which seems kind of messy to me. So what I did for Hawk is I just deleted the damn thing. Gemfile and gemfile.lock are gone from my RPM. I'm only using distro packaged gems that have become RPMs as my dependencies. Just said I'm not packaging gemfile.lock or gemfile. All of my dependencies are in my RPM spec file, so my regular package management tools pull in all of the pieces that I need. And I've also had to make a little change to one of the files in my Rails app, config boot.rb, which runs early on when your app starts up. So my gem file now looks like this. I've got, I need Rails, that little squiggly greater than thing means I need Rails greater than 3.2 but less than 4, so that's a nice broad range to work with. I need any version of fast gettext and something better than 0.43 of gettext internationalization Rails. These other two groups here, the development group and the test group, the next one, I should have asked, can everybody see that?
Yeah.
Good. Development and test, a Rails app can run in a few different modes. When it's running in production mode, it uses the things that aren't in any group and anything that's specifically in production. If you're running it in development or test, interestingly, I've got my GitHub repo hooked up to Travis CI to run tests every time I do a commit. So in this case, when it's running in test mode, it will actually go out to rubygems.org to pull in its dependencies, but that only happens during development or during continuous integration testing. This is something that end users never have to see or care about. The change that I had to make to my config boot.rb is usually this just consists of a line that says require bundler/setup. So when your app runs, bundler fires up, looks at the gem file, does its magic. In my case, I had to change this so that if the gem file exists, which it will during development and testing, use bundler, that's fine. Otherwise, I have to manually require those 3 gems, which are also listed in my gem file. That's a little bit of, I'm breaking a rule there. Don't repeat yourself is one of those things. In this case, I don't care because I've deliberately got a very short list of dependencies, and I don't mind that little bit of duplication to give me, to remove the problems that I would have at deployment time otherwise. What does this all give me? It means that I'm using bundler exactly when I want to use it during development and testing. It means that I am using distro-supplied dependencies at runtime. I have no hard runtime version binding at all. Dependency security updates work because of that hard binding has gone away, so we can ship a new Rails package and the application will just use it. But I've deliberately been very conservative in the set of in my specific set of dependencies, partly because the more dependencies I have, the more stuff that we actually have to support. And that's a we have to be very, what's the word, judicious? Sensible about what packages we include in a distro, because we have to stand behind this and go, yes, we're happy to run with this stuff, you know. So this works in my case. This approach may or may not work for other larger applications with more complicated sets of, I mean, it will still work, it just becomes more annoying to maintain a couple of lists of things. So for the 1.5 people who may actually have benefited from the from the Ruby and Rails specific stuff, I hope I've given, no, one of them's gone, there's only half a person left. I hope I've given you some things to think about and some possible solutions if you're trying to distribute packaged Rails apps. And for everybody else, the thought that I'd like to finish with is there is no spoon. No, hang on. There are more things in heaven and earth, Horatio, than are dreamt of in your philosophy. Which is not quite it either. When the going gets weird, the weird turn pro. Actually, I think it's all of these things. And what these three disparate quotes say to me is that the world is a really weird place. And the software development world, I don't think is an exception to this at all. So hopefully I've got people thinking a bit about how there's more than one deployment environment, and there's more than one type of developer and more than one type of user. And that all of these different people and environments, they all work a bit differently, and they have different needs and different requirements and different assumptions. And if we can remember this, and to borrow John's quote again, try to be liberal in what we accept and conservative in what we send, I think that we can all create better, more reliable software that's easier to deploy. And with that, thank you for your time.
This is a mind-boggling to me. I just don't understand why the version dependence is so restricted. Is it because the libraries is it because the libraries are changing very rapidly and their interfaces are changing sort of as a constantly moving task?
Yeah, the question was why are the versions so specific, and is it because things are moving so quickly?
Try to maintain an interface and then change the implementation behind it.
My personal, as Zane said, it's because it's Ruby. It's because it's, look. I think it's possibly a subcultural or cultural thing in particular development. It's not an environment. I can't use ecosystem because Florian will hit me. I think that what happens is somebody makes a cool toy, right? And they stick it up on GitHub, and their cool toy is nice because you just want to make a cool toy and it does these cool things. And then when you're doing that, you haven't necessarily thought very well about API design much or at all. And then you've published this thing, and if it's sufficiently cool, somebody else has gone and started using it. And then later on, when you go back to the cool thing that you were building, you realize it's a complete pile of shit, and you have to rewrite the whole thing and actually put an API on it, but you can't now because there's all these other developers who are using your cool thing version 1, and because of that style of development, all of those other developers over there suddenly become very, very paranoid about unstable or non-existent APIs and things breaking, hence the hard version dependency.
Just on that topic, there's also the software as a service developer culture. Is very much move fast and break things. And it's because they're building for a single production deployment of their application, and they're just publishing things kind of incidentally. They're not publishing them as we're doing this to support our users. They're publishing it because they can, which is cool. Yeah. But they don't have that culture of you are publishing an API, you now have a responsibility to maintain stability of that API.
Well, you shouldn't use Rails.
More often than not, you'll find that a lot of those gems, should that find their way into more common usage, that over time those strict dependencies become more flexible. As they become
more material. Look, Rails qua Rails has actually done a reasonably good job over, excuse me, all sorts of things break if you port from Rails 2 to Rails 3, but Rails 2 dot whatever, the APIs didn't change that much, or things were being deprecated slowly, so Rails qua Rails was being quite sensible about this. But there's so many other bits and pieces in that gem ecosystem, sorry Florian, he hates that term. There's so many other bits and pieces for which that isn't true, where people haven't actually done their APIs properly or tried to maintain stability or whatever. Yep.
Have you heard of RBN?
RBN.
Yes. There's one GitHub dude called S. Stevenson. I used it a bit when you about through people that work. Allows you to run different versions of gems and different versions of Ruby from like your home directory, basically. You can install whatever version of Ruby, whatever install version of the gem you want.
Is there anything to do with RBN?
Sorry?
RBN?
I think it's a newer
Similar.
Okay.
I'll show you after.
Yeah, look, I haven't used that because, again, I have a slightly different deployment scenario than the thing that I manage. I have a Linux distribution that I have to support with particular versions of things, a stable series of applications for a long time. And this is, going back to your point before, that's a completely different model than just keep deploying until it works, right? So.
Let's have one more and then finish up.
I'll just ask perspective. I mean, looking at the packaging from Ruby and Ruby and Rails, one of the things that frustrated me going from sysadmin to software engineering has been the distros repackaging, wanting to repackage Rails and its associated dependencies, because they're so often vastly out of date. There is just not just even the LTS, but even just the rolling pieces. Your thoughts on that?
Okay, so the question was, what are my thoughts on distro packages lagging behind whatever the native language package system does? We're all screwed. It's going to be a problem because of all of the things that are available in a native language package management system. No distro will ever pick up all of these. They'll pick up the ones that distro wants to support and make readily available through the distro package management tools. And you get the advantage of distro packages and trust that I was talking about before, but you lose the bleeding edge, and you also, if you're writing an application that has intersections between what's been natively packaged and what's language packaged, if I can confuse everybody by mixing my terms up, you get into trouble. I don't have a good answer for that, other than that if you sorry?
If people are interested in this stuff, it affects the Python community as well, and there's a talk in the May conference on Thursday, which is about the Python, attempting to deal with this in the Python space.
Who's leading it, Nick Coughlin?
I don't know. Who could that possibly be?
But surely to this point anyway, is even if you take distro out of it, the fact that you're bundling stuff up to incredibly specific versions, and that every app has its own incredibly specific versions, and you completely lose sight of security patching, or you have apps that there's a culture saying, well, I'm going to opt to this old version that you can't patch for security.
That's a cultural problem in some of the upstream packaging communities, and without anyway, Thursday.
But the distro piece of that is kind of a red herring to Tim's main point.
So it's a problem that needs to be fixed upstream. The distros can't solve it. Upstream has to fix it.
And I think we're pretty much out of time. So everybody, please thank you.